tea.
So we've been having a bunch of conversations about this collection of conscious Bible stories that you've been writing. And you know that it interests me because we've discovered that we have similar starting points, totally different. You grew up in the Jehovah Witness tradition. I grew up in a rural community in southwestern Ontario in the Mennonite faith. But what was similar, I think, was a structure, a way to think about the world, values, very concrete ways of thinking. And so when I read stories like you've written, which kind of blow up some of that traditional ways of thinking, it makes me really curious. Like what brought you there? So I think my first question to you is, what was the impetus to even start writing these stories?
I just like you said, growing up Jehovah's Witness, I had a certain belief system ingrained into me, and at some point into my 20s, I started questioning these beliefs, and then that set me on a path, on a journey of self-discovery and personal business and relationship building, and something that I really enjoy doing as far as just, I guess, as a hobby, is kind of thinking a lot, as especially about subjects that are meaningful to me. And so as I've unraveled the belief system that I grew up with, I've kind of developed a new belief system for myself, which is more empowering, as opposed to the limiting belief system that has been kind of instilled into me. And so, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I like you use the word unravel, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that, because that's a word I've used in my own life. Like, when I appreciate very much the tradition that I came from, and I appreciate that it did provide structure and a value system and a belief system, and it was a really safe community to grow up in. And but I too had to go through a process of unraveling as I started to see the world in a different way. So say a little more about the unraveling process. I have a lot of questions for you about what we're going to call story one, or what you call book zero, I think. But can you say a little bit more about unraveling? Like, what started the unraveling process? Can you think of a moment in time, or?
Well, what started unraveling a lot for me was going through a healing process for myself, where I was healing my body and healing a lot of guilt and resentment that I had been holding on to for a long time. And that was obviously taking a lot of energy out of me. So it took a lot from me, just having that weight. And so as I unraveled where that pain stemmed from, it started to heal. And so I healed myself so much that I had all this extra energy. And then so I started unraveling other things that bothered me, about not just myself, but of like the way I grew up. And so these stories that have been told not only to me, but to billions of people across time, there was something kind of off-putting about them to me. Like, why are these stories kind of have like this same sort of foundation where they come from, as far as like everybody's a victim and nobody's taking responsibility for their actions. And so those things were so unsettling to me that I unraveled them in a way where it was like it was very natural to me to just put them back together in a way that I saw more fitting, especially like as a story I would feel comfortable telling my kids. Like, I wouldn't feel comfortable telling the stories, that we were told.
They're brutal.
They're
Yeah,
brutal.
I know.
They're brutal.
When I was young, I think we've talked about this too, like how you absorb things as a child, and then you may watch a TV show or read something much later in life as an adult and go, wait, I had no idea it was so brutal or awful. So thank goodness our child mind doesn't acts as everything all at once. But so let's come to the story. So story 0, which you call Before the Beginning.
Yeah.
And the first line is, before the beginning, God felt lonely because she was alone. The obvious thing that stood out to me when I read that was you gave the divine a feminine identity. So what was that?
Yeah, the reason I portray God as a female is because to me it becomes evident that the females on this planet are the creators. They're essentially um, factories of life, and then the male plays more of the role as of the farmer. Someone who plants the seed, and so that was one of the first things that I was able to piece together for myself. And then also speaking to a lot of Buddhist friends that I have, they also have their God is more of a feminine. Nothing is really said, but it's more of a feminine energy that they have. So that was also interesting.
So it was natural. It made sense to you. I thought about that a lot when I started unraveling the narratives of my childhood, and it started for me my first year of university. I actually was studying theology, and it was like a blow my mind moment. It's like, wait, this was just collected. It was made up. That this Bible didn't descend from the sky and appear that way. I mean, it seems so obvious when we talk about it now, but when you grow up in the kind of traditions that we did, these are things that we accepted. And then learning, like a single pronoun, like how that shaped my view of the divine. So for people sharing the stories that you written with their children or reading them, and you using the divine or the feminine profile, I think is really powerful because it's shaping that image right from the beginning. So in your story, God feels alone, she was alone, and makes a replica for herself it's Lucifer, Lucy for short. But I want to pick up on this and ask you about it. So you describe this as exactly alike, but not really. It was like God was looking in a mirror and seeing the exact opposite patterns of behavior. So this sense that it's the same and different. Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, to me this was a very special moment in the beginning of consciousness, essentially. So I feel like this sentence represents, for me, it represents like the Big Bang. Like she was so lonely and felt so empty inside, and everything she created had at this point everything was perfect, in line with and in harmony with the natural flow of nature. And so when things are going just so smooth for such a infinite amount of time, like something started to brew inside of her. Something was, enough is enough. Like it's too good. And so like to me, I see like an image of like a cute little baby tugging on his mom's skirt. That's really cute until it isn't. Like how long is it cute for? At some point enough is enough. Like it's too cute, too long. I need a break. And so this kind of stewed inside of God until she blew up, and she created what at that time was the greatest thing she could ever think of. And this was a friend that was like her, in a sense of like wasn't just following orders, but would be there to question her, even her. And then so this to me, like the beginning of Lucifer was like the best that she could have possibly do at that time. Like she'd been thinking about it for a long time. It's been brewing inside of her, and she finally did it, and it caused a big bang in my head.
That blows apart the entire Lucifer concept, right? And actually, I'm glad I asked you, because I took something different. When I first read it, was going along the lines of the way we think about, God and the devil, this darkness and the light, that you were integrating the two into one person, but that you described it just now as this, like the Big Bang. This was the beginning of it all. This was the beginning of creation. Um, Gives it that much more, a lot more things to think about. Like, as I've said, every time I talk to you, my brains get a little scrambled and I need to rethink things that I've thought. So,
well, this stems from an idea that was kind of unsettling to me for a long period of time, because there seemed to be this argument between evolution versus creation. And I always wondered why. Like, why is it one or the other? And so this to me kind of represents a marriage of the two, of like, yeah, this is creation at its best, and it uses the process of evolution. Like, I don't even see the argument. Like, they're one and the same.
See, now I'm scrambled again. Wait, but it's 6. Okay, so I like the whole integrative aspect. So I'm looking again. I've highlighted a few things I wanted to ask you about. So God creates Lucy. And now you've described it as kind of this Big Bang moment. They spend time together. They're having fun together. And there's this moment when God finds Lucy looking a little sad and starts to question, what's the matter? And Lucy describes this sense of wanting to be free. And God asks, free of what? He says, free of you. And God's questioning, but does that mean you don't like being with me? No, not at all. More, I just feel like I'm limited in my personal pursuits. So tell me a little bit more about that. I mean, I'm going to all of the religious concepts I'm familiar with, like free will, but I'm guessing that's not at all, having talked to you up until now, what you were thinking about. It's something quite different.
So it gets to the point where, stories tend to repeat themselves. And this is a story that I see a lot, where in any relationship, it kind of begins to fade at some point. It's not as exciting as it once was. And in this case, there's a misunderstanding within Lucy, which is that his existence revolves only around God. And so he only has a single perspective. But he also sees that God is the great creator. Everything he knows stems from God. And that is a little bit unsettling to him in a way of where he wants that for himself. He wants that freedom. And he doesn't quite know what it is. That's why he doesn't come out and say it. It just makes him more distant. But to God, he doesn't, she doesn't allow that to happen. Like, you have to clear things up. You can't just pretend like nothing's wrong. And he tried to pretend at first, right? Which is odd. In her reality, nobody pretends. Nobody's playing, Mm-hmm. So he tries to brush it off at first as if nothing was the matter, and she insisted on knowing the truth. And this is when it comes out. Like, this is within himself, like a big moment. Like, he stands up for himself. And so this is like a pursuit and a feeling that I believe humanity has within ourselves, is we want to be free. But oftentimes we don't even know free of what. Like, it's just something that's in our DNA. We want this freedom. And then, so if you realize, like, today in modern days, like, for the most part, we have so much freedom, we don't know what to do with it. And so we do a lot of things to keep ourselves busy. And then so for this story, and what it represents is this want to be free of something that you don't even know what it is quite yet, but you want it.
So there's something you said along there. I can't remember the exact words, but what I was thinking was, is this really personal for you? Like, that because you write very metaphorically, esoterically, and spiritually, but being free, I'm not quite know where I'm going to go with this line of questioning, but is there something in connection with your family, with your upbringing, is it Is that sense really, as you started to unravel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's very personal to me. I unravel it to understand it in all things and see it in everything. I saw it within myself and within my own family. And um, there's this story in my family where my family essentially are being persecuted from Cuba, and they run. And this story is all over the
Yeah.
world. People are persecuted and they run off. This is happening today, um, and so having these stories represented in my own family as far as a pursuit, I saw myself in a moment where I was pursuing this freedom at some point, and I was pursuing it vigorously. Like I was really wanting to understand what this freedom was to me, and what I really wanted it to be for myself. And then I started seeing the connections where I saw a connection where I was essentially running off with the same story of my parents, and it was unnecessary because they had already gotten me to freedom, and I hadn't even realized how free I already was.
There we are. That's it. Yeah. I'm glad we went down there. So, what was it? You didn't realize how free you already were. Because this comes out in the story. That's what Lucy ultimately realizes. Lucy goes off, does all this amazing stuff, and Lucy's freedom, wonder, curiosity, but then comes back. And I'm looking for the words. They embrace, they're happy to see each other. But you describe this, Lucy's acknowledgement that he realized he was already free.
Yeah.
So let's bring that back home, because I think it's so interesting. Especially, I hope it's okay I'm asking you this line of questioning in relation to your family, because I find it so fascinating. Yeah. Can you say more about what that recognition was for you? How did you come to understand that you had already had freedom in that narrative that your family was looping, if you will?
Right. Yeah, in that context of where in my family there's this story where they're pursuing freedom, and they made it to America, where I was born, in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Right? That's the story being sold here.
Yeah.
Or not here. We're in
somewhere else. We're in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah. But essentially, even though I was going at that time down many rabbit holes and was finding lots of evidence as to why I wasn't free, even though I was in the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? I kind of got to an understanding where I really was free, because I couldn't think of a single thing that I wanted to do that I couldn't do. Like, I have a passport. I can go anywhere I want. Like, what am I talking about? Like,
Yeah.
And so I realized in that moment where all this lack of freedom that I was seeing for myself wasn't real. It was all hypothetical. It was all in theory. Where if this were to happen, if my rights were to be questioned, I would say this, and I was stuck in this loop to where I didn't need to be. I was enslaved to it because of myself. Nobody was doing it to me. This was all my own doing, and so nobody's like holding me to anything or forcing me to do anything. This is all in my imagination. And once I realized that, I was like, oh, I'm already free. Like, how free do I want to be? Like, what does that even mean? And so I was like, oh, this is it. Like, I'm already free. I just have to know what I want and then go do it.
That's really powerful. And we've been in this beautiful setting where we met in a quirky little fitness retreat hotel. We connected, and we've had these really meaningful conversations, and it's a moment you realize when you strip, the veneer of a person, that we're all having this human journey, and it's very similar in a lot of ways. But something you and I have been talking about is that the power of, well, let's talk about a family narrative and how we can stay in that loop of that narrative. And many people do till they die. I mean, there's many people in my family heritage that are looping that way. It's not a bad life, it's just a life that's looping in those stories. And so I've been really inspired to think, as we've been talking about and reading the ideas you put together in these stories, to really break out even further from that narrative. And I love that recognition that, wait, nothing more needs to happen. I'm already free. I mean, there can be things like your father who was imprisoned. So that's a different story. We're not talking about that, where there's a physical not being free and something that is very real like that. This is let's call it a psychology of freedom, or, right? That's what we're talking about. Yeah. It's not like, there are moments
but even then, like my dad would share stories with me of when he was free and he was strong to his faith. It was freeing to him, even in that setting, and he was able to even then, not having anything real to hold on to as far as like a law that would back free thinking, but he was able to grasp onto his faith, and because of that, it was courageous for him that other people saw, and it gravitated people to him in a way where it was freeing and empowering to him. And you hear stories like this. I've seen documentaries of like where prisoners, it gets to the point where they make peace with what they've done, and that's freeing. And so it gets to the point where even if you are in a cage, you can still be free, and that's an empowering thought to me.
That's going to go down a whole lot. That's probably going to play out. I mean, that is fascinating. Yeah. I do want to ask you, let's come back to the story itself. Because each one of those we could pick up on and have a whole conversation around. But, so, Lucy comes back. Lucy's realized that he's been free all along. There's this moment when Lucy God come back together. Now, this is the part that it really got me thinking. Lucy has this idea and presents to God, I'm going to get this right, to basically start a game, right? And I got a little bit lost here at first because the concept was so different. Looking for I asked you directly about it, and that's where I realized possibly your age difference, also you're a guy, I'm a girl. I just haven't spent, and it's not specific to males or females, but I just haven't spent a lot of time with video games. But I was at first kind of uncomfortable thinking about God and Lucy creating this game. Like, it's like, we're going on Matrix here. And I mean, I can go there, but it's, one has to be ready. So you described, and I'd love you to describe it again for me. You played a lot of video games, and you still do.
No, I don't play video games
anymore. Okay, you did a lot growing up. Okay, and there was a moment when you were playing a specific game. It was Grand Theft Auto, I think. Mm-hmm. Okay, so describe this and what that was, and then I know it relates back to the story.
Okay, well, to go back to the beginning of the story, of the beginning of Lucy and God and their relationship unraveling, they're playing games. That's what they do. That's what they do. They're children at heart, and they're just playing games. So everywhere they go, they're just playing word games and pretending. Right? That's their favorite game, pretend. And so, in my childhood, in my era, I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s. Video games were a big part of my life growing up. So I saw a big evolution of video games from like Mario World into games where, you can see people's facial expressions, and the conversation was always there as a kid, is like, man, this thing is getting real. Like, you can barely tell the difference anymore. You can feel it in your control, and
right.
And then so now I haven't spent much time at all playing in these like Oculus Rift or virtual reality worlds, but my understanding is that it's really cool in there, right? And like very realistic. Um, and so the idea in my imagination is that we've been playing a game all along, you know, and we start as kids. It's very natural to play. It's what we do. It's not until later that we start taking things more seriously. Uh, and so our natural state is play. Um, there was a time when I was playing these video games a lot, in my early 20s especially, because I had some money and like time, so I was like playing video games.
Yeah.
Uh, and there's the Grand Theft Auto game where essentially it's a crime game, and you can be a crime boss if you want, right? But you could also just go out and go to the store, get a taxi. You don't have to rob people, right? You can do whatever you want. You're free in this game. And in this game, there's like a home base. And you know, when the game starts, the character's poor, right? He doesn't have very many points. And as the game progresses, the idea is to accumulate wealth. But the game is always the same. You always have this same home base with a bed and a couch and a TV, and it looks a lot like my living room, right? And in this game, you can, as the character in this first world, you can sit down in front of your TV and play a video game, and you can play the same game, Grand Theft Auto. And then in that game, it kind of zooms in and it sucks you into that version of the game, and then you can do the same thing. Like you can go again and then inside of that, you can go and play the game again.
Yeah.
And so I essentially was doing that one afternoon, and I started to see like what was happening, and I started to get anxious and nervous, as far as like, because I started thinking like, because the thoughts are like, oh, these games are only progressing. Well, how far did it come? Did it like? And I started looking at myself in the first world, like looking at my hands and stuff, like in a different way.
Yeah.
And it shook me to the point where I couldn't play video games for a very long time after that.
Well, I remember you describing that, like, am I not knowing if you were in the game or in, like, what was real life anymore? I mean,
Exactly.
I've never had that experience, so this is because I haven't gone to, but it blew my mind when you said that. And to know now that the games are even so much more advanced and so much more realistic. Yeah. So that plays into this. And can you describe a little bit about what Lucy proposes to God?
Right. So it gets to the point where Lucy has a great idea, and he needs God's help to make it come to fruition. And he describes to her what the game is that he wants to play, right? And this is a normal conversation for them. It's like good old times. It's like if they were never apart. It's like, and so he proposes to play kind of a dangerous game, you know, something different, something like, you know, a little bit more risky, a world of chaos and destruction, a world of challenge, persecution, and triumph. And so at first this was unsettling to God, and she was like, I don't know about this, like this seems really dangerous. And then that's when Lucy kind of lights up, you know, and he says, well, that's what makes it so great, you know, it is dangerous, but I want you to know I'm not taking this lightly. You know, I've been putting a lot of thought into this. This is important to me. And so it gets to the point where God can see how important it is to Lucy, and she's actually really, really proud of him. You know, he's come such a long way. And so essentially she agrees to play the game. And then so what I'm leading the reader to believe here is that the game is this. This is the world that they have created, the game world. Where essentially they're the characters. Each character that we see, you and I, were a combination of not only God and Lucifer, but every story that's ever been told on a loop. Like we're made of it. Like we're made up of these stories, and we're here now. This is where the game begins, when you realize you're here now, when you become conscious of the game. And so this represents the consciousness at its greatest, because that's the practice of consciousness, is not being lost in the past or as far as the stories of where we come from, or not being concerned about the future, but being present and doing the best we can now, and giving this moment the best of ourselves, so that we can have this a beautiful story, an empowering story, as opposed to, the stories that were history. This represents history in a different way, where it's no longer his story, right? I like to take words apart. Like, it's who is he, and why do we keep repeating his stories? Like, this is about our story, where we take full ownership of our story. And so no matter what kind of trauma we find ourselves in, or place where we've been through a lot, we can change how we've been looking at that to empower us, as opposed to keeping us down. And so these traumas show us what we're made of, essentially. And so it makes us stronger, because that's what friction does. That's what resistance does. It's not meant to hold you down. It's meant to make you stronger, unless you believe it's meant to hold you down. And so you get what you want.
Well, I am thrilled that you found the inspiration to write these stories. Because we've been talking half an hour about the first one, and you're writing these as children's stories. Obviously, the concepts can be accessed on so many levels. So I'm excited to keep carrying on the conversation when we begin to discuss book 1.
Yeah.
And I picture your books like, this is we're talking, on like coffee tables, and because they're short enough to maybe it's the new salon,
Yeah.
Yeah, they're short enough to read and then break it down, and I mean, for those of us who grew up in structured faith religious communities, it will have there'll be a whole other angle we'll put on it. But for those of us who didn't, can access it differently. So I'm excited to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking me. It really, you bring the best out of me, so I'm really grateful.
We're glad we found each other here.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome.
Yeah.
That was cool. Thanks so much.